Today on Sound Advice Entrepreneurs Unfiltered, brought to you by Sage, it's all about building a business with culture and character. Gush Mundae moved from Delhi to the UK when he was 5. He couldn't speak a word of English and he was targeted by racist bullies. He felt like an outsider until he found his tribe in the hip-hop and graffiti scene, which led to a career in graphic design. Now he's the founder of brand agency Bulletproof, employing more than 300 people across 6 offices globally. Gush is here to talk about thinking like a misfit, making people feel like they belong, and his mission to put a dent in the establishment. Gush, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kate. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So I want to dive straight in. So you moved to Southall when you were just a kid. New culture, new language, new environment, new food. And I know you struggled to fit in. Just tell us a little bit about that experience and your early memories.
Yeah, well, I couldn't speak English. I could speak 4 Indian dialects. I couldn't speak English. We moved from quite a large house, in the suburbs of Delhi to 1 bedroom. We lived in, all 4 of my family lived in 1 bedroom. My mum, my dad, my sister and myself. So it was completely different. It was very cold, whereas I've been used to it being very warm, and so everything felt different, and having to go to school, a new school, was really like a kind of an experience I'd never had before. I really enjoyed school in India from what I remember, and I was quite kind of outcast in the school that I attended over here.
And you experienced quite a lot of racial abuse, didn't you, as a kid and growing up, not just from other school kids, but also from the police and the establishment as well? Yeah,
from everyone. It was just a difficult. I think it was a difficult time for the country. If I look back on it now, a lot of social political unrest. A lot of, I guess, a lot of the English thinking their identities they're losing their identity. The National Front was a big thing, and honestly, everyone I came into contact with at certain points, at certain junctures, there was racism there, and I either experienced it, in totality, where I was called, various names, you black this, black bastard, packy, all this kind of stuff, or it was sort of, I was just kind of ignored, in some shops, so the more well-to-do neighbourhoods that I would frequent, if I was going there, they'd just sort of ignore me, and then where I grew up and where I was growing, so it would be very much in your face. I remember numerous occasions of just grown men shouting, out of vans at me, and I'm a kid, right? I don't know what's going on, I'm just walking, I'm just trying to walk across the street, they're stopping their vans and shouting at me and stuff like that. So, and then as I got older, I started to experience that with authority as well, so within the police system, constantly getting stopped and searched, which I know still goes on today, and it's just not it's just not a great technique. We'd be rallied out. We'd be driving our cars. Very young, and we'd be taken out of our cars. The cars would be searched. In and out. No apologies, nothing. We'd be walking down the street. And we'd be accosted, and we'd be split up into our group of 3 or 4 of us. Just walking. Everything searched. It was just a very difficult time. And when society treats you like that, when authority treats you like that, you don't belong, because they're not doing that to everyone else. While we're being searched, groups of, let's just say it how it is. Groups of white kids are walking past, and looking at us, and so it's not happening to everyone. So you're kind of going, what's the difference here? What have I done? And so, yeah, we got it from everywhere,
And that sort of feeling of not belonging, of always feeling different to everybody else, you must have built up quite a lot of anger and resentment. How did you break the cycle?
Well, so when I was young, so I'm talking sort of 6, 7. I was just kind of trying to comprehend it, and I couldn't, and it just made me very. I remember feeling just a bit confused, and quite emotional about it, not really understanding. As I got a little older, around 12, 13, I started getting very angry about it, and by then I could speak English, and I started getting into fights, scraps, with anyone and everyone. There was one occasion where it just happened, and then after that, I was just very angry for quite a long time, and I don't think I was a very nice person, I kind of carried this chip with me, I knew I didn't fit in, and if someone would look at me the wrong way, we'd just get into it, and I remember. Yeah, I remember being quite physical, very angry, and very confused still, as to why it was happening. But the way I dealt with it was very different.
Yeah, and you channeled some of that sort of anger and aggression into a more creative outlet, didn't you? And you sort of found that tribe in graffiti and hip hop. Tell us about that and how you sort of found your identity there.
Yeah, I did. So what happened is, it goes right back to my schooling, and so I didn't have a great schooling, and it started when I came to the UK. So because I couldn't speak English, for some reason, teachers would ask me to speak, from books and make me stand up in front of the whole class, right? And the class would laugh because I couldn't speak English, right? And instead of seeing that and kind of protecting me, they just let me carry on. And so and the reason that's important is I started reading comic books, so comic books became a staple because there were ways for me to understand story and narrative through color and vision and very small sound bites, really. So I actually learned to read through comic books, and because they were so visual, I started to draw. So I started to draw the comics, and I started to draw the characters, and I fell in love with some of the characters, especially Batman and the Hulk, and I loved the Hulk because his way of dealing with everything was just smashing it apart, So I just, I loved, I just loved his way of, right, I'm not having this, I'm just going to break it, And so, I used to draw them, all the time, and that really became the precursor to me loving art, and because I still didn't love school because of that experience, and you harbour that experience for a long, long time, What I did love was art, and I was encouraged by one teacher, and I think this happens a lot, actually, you only need one person to really care about you. And I remember he sat me down and just said, look, you've got a great talent, but I've got news for you. Talent is everywhere, and it's really how you choose to use it. And if you want to focus it, I think you could go far. But if you don't, it's just a waste, And I was doing a lot of graffiti at the time, and loving it, And that was kind of, in the dark, that was over the weekends and what have you. So I wasn't doing a lot of schoolwork, And he was just saying, look, something's got to give. You've got, I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying focus on a creative, career, if you like. And he said to me, look, I've got an ex-student who used to study under me. She now teaches the graphics course at Hounslow College, which is West Thames now. And unbeknown to me, it's one of the best courses in the country. And he said, look, I'd just like you to go there and have a chat with her. So I went there and had a chat with her, and she was like, I love your work, it's really strong, it's very graphic. And I didn't know what that meant, and she was like, well, it's very stylistic. And with this, you could create, she was like, you could create posters. I was like, nah. She was like, you create brochures. I was like, nah. And then she was like, record sleeves. And there was that light bulb moment, when I was like, yeah, because I loved hip hop, I loved music, the dance culture, the graffiti, right? That's where I found my belonging, so not fitting in at school, really, not fitting in the way the society, was. Hip hop was very new, to me, and I found that calling there, and And I started like everyone, a bit of dancing. I loved the fashion, I loved the clothing, loved the music, still do, still my big passion. And then I started getting into graffiti, right? And because I read the comics, and because I had this, I could write really well. I had a good sense of colour and typography. It just came quite easy, And so it was his encouragement to do something with that would end up being Bulletproof. That I love, and I'm really thankful for that, So thanks, Mr. Moffat.
Thanks, Mr. Moffat. It's amazing how pivotal those, small conversations can be. That changed your entire journey in your career. So tell us then. So you went into graphic design. How did that? What made you take the leap and set up your own agency, Bulletproof? And you've turned it into this multi-million-pound business. What was the push point for you? So
when I studied graphic design, started to love it, really started to love typography, and again that came from letter forms, from graffiti, and everything else. And then I left during a recession, and it wasn't great, and everything we had done was handwritten, so we'd learned everything that was hand drawn. And the Mac was just really coming into place. So everywhere, wanted you to use a Mac. They'd sort of look at your book and go, actually, can you just use that computer? And so I had to learn that myself. So I did. And I joined a couple of places. So I joined a very small shop which did record sleeves. That's what they created. It was called Shoot That Tiger. Amazing. We had an amazing little culture. There was only 10 of us. It was a great atmosphere. People were amazing. We worked really long hours, and we did some lovely work. The only problem with that was I quickly learnt that for every great record sleeve you get to work on, there's like 100 boy bands or girl bands. Even back then. So it's really not creative as you wanted. One of the guys left there, and he took me with him to a much bigger agency. Although it was small at the time, it grew to 100 people within a year, and there I was being exposed to global clients, but the culture wasn't right, or what I understood to be culture then. It was the feeling is the way I describe it. So I just thought there's got to be a way of creating a business where you get global work, but you have a great culture where everyone feels included, and we're working hard, but we're enjoying it, and we're learning, and we're progressing all together. And I couldn't find it. So I freelanced for a little bit, just couldn't find it. So I thought, rather than sort of moan about it, I'm just going to have to set it up. So I set up Bulletproof. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had a little bit of savings. I put that kind of went all on the first quarter's rent and a Mac, and that was it. So it's really basic. I got a really good address, which was in Covent Garden. It was a room, but the address was amazing. Betterton Street in Covent Garden. So it looked good on a business card, so I did all of that. I did all the things that I thought were right and important, with the little knowledge I had. And I set up, and that was it.
And how did you get the business off the ground? What was the big turning point for Bulletproof?
So what we did, so I started the business, and then I basically got Johnny, who's my business partner, I roped him into it because we were winning lots of advertising projects or briefs or pitches, and I wanted someone to bounce ideas off, and we'd worked together at college anyway, and what would happen was I'd be on the phone every day calling up agencies if they needed support, calling up marketing businesses, calling up brands, and really going, walking my wares to them every day. When I'd land work and convince them that we could do this great work, I then had to get back to the office that we shared, which was, smaller than this boardroom, and we had to do the work. So in the evening, we were doing the work, so it would be all day kind of selling, showing what we can do, convincing clients we're great. In the evening, it would be doing the work till, very late hours in the morning, and then often getting a night bus home, So the turning point really came when we sent out a mailer. It was kind of like the last big push that we had. We had a bit of money in the bank, and we just thought we've got to do something, because it was just tiring, right? Just going out all the time, trying to sell, trying to meet people, and then really doing one project, getting one project out of that, you know. And so we did a mailer. We created 100 of them. We sent them out to the great and the good, you know. And one of the clients that we sent it to was Coca-Cola, one of the companies, and it was that very rare timing where it was the right place at the right time. You know, so often it's not that, you know, it's that sliding doors moment where it's actually, had you come to us, you know, 2 months ago, we'd have given you all our work. And we got a call. And I remember I was on Tottenham Court Road. It was near Christmas. I was trying to do a bit of shopping. And I got this call, you know, and I had this flip phone, you know, so I thought I was the shit. You know, I had this flip phone and I was like, hello? And she went, is that Gush? And I went, yeah. And she went, oh, hi, it's Karen here from Coke. And I was like, oh my God. Hi, Karen. And then, you know, trying to be all cool, you know, trying to style it out in like the doorway of this shop, you know, with hundreds of people walking past, you know. And she was like, look, we got the mailer. We love it. We have something we'd like to talk to you about. Can we come in tomorrow? You know, and I remember just going, yes, of course, no problem. Trying to be all kind of, you know, cool, get my breathing right and everything, you know, putting the phone down, you know, snapping it shut, running back to the office saying, we've got to clear up. We've got to clear this shit up. We've got clients coming in tomorrow, you know, because we were like 4 boys in an office, you know, and that was it. And she came and she brought one of the brand managers with her, and we got our first gig for Coke, and that was the turning point. That was amazing, you know.
So you went from being this quite kind of scrappy startup, you know, working really late hours, getting the night bus home, surviving on fast food, to having to quite quickly professionalize the business and working for global clients like Coca-Cola. How did you professionalize the business? What were some of those crucial steps you had to take?
Business wasn't explained to me, you know. It wasn't like you do this, you do that, and it's a very different time. You know, when you talk to people about pre-internet and pre-email, it sounds like the 1800s, right? And it really isn't, you know. So we were professional in that, you know, we could take a brief really well, you know, we'd make our notes, we'd ask all the right questions, even if we didn't understand everything, you know. And then we worked really well to deadlines, you know, we put heart and soul into it, you know. So, and that's all we knew. So although we were scrappy, you know, we never let our clients down. And really, we just kind of thought the thing that's going to tip it is great original ideas and creativity. So we've always had that as a business, and that's a staple really of Bulletproof today and what we represent. So that's never changed, you know. So that was how we dealt with it. What I had to do was I had to really think about the numbers, and that's what I wasn't used to, you know. So I'm a creative by heart, and I still love the creative process. I still love seeing graffiti, you know. I still love all that, you know. So what I had to do, what I had to learn was, how do you create that value, you know? So because what I was doing was looking at, okay, there's 4 of us working on this. We're working all night on this. It's X amount of hours, so it equals that, you know. And although that's not wrong in itself, it's not really saying, well, actually, this is a campaign that they're going to own for the next, you know, 2 years, and it's going to be global, you know. So I wasn't really thinking about it like that. So that was the big thing, you know. And actually, Karen, to her credit, we were invited to work on the Coca-Cola Christmas campaign, which is their biggest campaign. And when I put the when I put the estimate in, she came back and said, Gush, look, we need to talk. And I was like, okay. And she went, look, it's too low. You know, you've got to make it higher, because if you don't, you know, my boss is going to think you guys aren't going to deliver, and I know you're going to deliver it. And you know, she's going to think what's missing, because we're used to a little. So I said okay, and I didn't ask her how much by, but I stuck another £10,000 on it, which was everything. Okay, it was everything to us, and she went, yeah, great, signed off. You know, so I had to learn that. That was how we. So I had to learn how to, you know, invoice and, you know, create and generate estimates, you know, properly, you know, not just based on hours, but actually based on how they're going to use it, which was a massive learning curve for me.
And as a creative then, did you go on any business courses or read any business books, or was it just about finding your way and asking as you went along?
I didn't know what I was doing. Okay, I I still don't read the books really. I still don't go on courses. I kind of think that everyone who runs those courses had never run a business, because I think there's theory and then there's practice, and so never did that. Just kind of, look, if I'm really honest, I think just made it up as I went along, and I don't think there's anything wrong in that. I don't, I'm not apologetic for that. Every day's learning, so you're learning new things all the time. We're asking all the right questions, I've got Johnny there, we're bouncing off one another in terms of, is that right? Does that feel right? Is that cool? And then, and asking our friends, our peers as well for, any kind of advice we could get, which was a little bit sparse, I've got to be honest. So, but it felt right. And I think proof is, if you do a really great bit of work, you get rewarded with more work, and that was happening quite a lot, especially with Coca-Cola. So we knew we were doing something right. And then, these amazing marketeers would go, just wait here. I want you to meet, my counterpart in this area, and so we loved that because, we love people. We love that connection, and so we knew it was going well because every time we went to Coca-Cola, when they were in Hammersmith, in the hallowed halls of Hammersmith, we'd pick up another brief. We'd go to deliver a presentation and pick up 2 briefs. It was just incredible, so we knew it was right, and it never fazed us because when you're like 28, and people are chucking work, you're like, yeah, I'll take it. No, no problem. So it felt intuitive, and that's what, intuitively it felt right. And I'm a great believer in trusting, instinct and your gut, and so, and I still believe in that today. If you think something's off, it probably is, and so that's how we navigated it,
So Gush, you've always stood out for thinking differently, and I know you said before that as an immigrant you have to adapt. So how has that ability to adapt and reinvent yourself helped you as a business owner, particularly in recent turbulent times?
Well, I think as an immigrant, a bit of an outcast, I think you have to be resilient, right? Because you're not treated the same, you're not treated fairly. So you've got to think in a different way. I call it hustle, and one of the team coined hustle and heart, which is it's a basketball term, and that's what we're all about. So, I think when you're an immigrant, when you're an outsider, you have to think around the periphery quite a lot, and you can't go with the flow because you're not part of it. And so you're always adapting and thinking about the next thing, or what if I did this? So our business has been built on that from the start. It's problem solving, it's solution solving, and so that's how my brain works. That's how I've always been brought up as well, and I've had to learn that myself. So it's about thinking through things in different ways. So when the pandemic hit, for example, I think none of us knew, I think that's fair, none of us knew what was going to happen, right? But we made a decision very early on that our team were feeling, they were feeling very unsure about things. And this word kept coming up like furlough and everything else. And I had to Google that. I didn't know what furlough was. I had no idea, who knew? And so we kind of looked at the books. We looked at, we called our clients, and we made a decision 4 weeks in to say to everyone, look, we're not going to furlough anyone. We're keeping everyone on. We want you to feel really reassured. And as we are working apart, sort of together but apart, we're going to put in regular catch-ups, regular meetings, regular Q&As where we can talk to you and you can ask us anything you want about the business, which we do anyway. We do that anyway within the business, but we're all working virtually, so that was quite difficult, And I think it's about listening, and as things unfold, going, you've got an idea and a process, and if things change, you just got to rethink that narrative a little bit, and that's what we're very good at. We don't just kind of go, we've got this in place now, that's the way it's going to be for the next 5 years. As things change, as the landscape changes in terms of business, or something else we have to learn or a new technology comes in, we rethink things and put them back into play, and I think that's cool. I think not enough people do that, and I think as an immigrant, you're always thinking like that because you've got to be on your toes all the time, and so I think it really helps, as I say, what I thought was a weakness, being an outsider and having that outside perspective, I really think is a superpower to think differently,
And you're also supporting communities and underprivileged kids through charity work as well, aren't you?
Yeah, so we have a charity fund that my wife and I own, called Sarvan's Trust, which is it basically supports children. It's a fund it's a charity that supports underprivileged children, and our basis is that we use learning and education as a way of self-improvement and progression, because actually in many parts of the world, education isn't a given, and it's certainly not free. And so schools, we believe, are kind of like it's quite interesting, my background, but, we believe that schools in these local communities are the cornerstone, because there's so much more than just a place for education. It's actually a place for community and people to come together. They do so many functions for the villages and what have you. So we've built a school in Barmakona village, which is in the Assam region of India. That's for 1,800 children. And when I say we built it, we funded the project through Action Aid, who are an amazing charity, and they find us these projects. We then take that project on, fund it, and as part of that, we went over there to actually clear the land and lay the first initial bricks for the foundation, which was amazing. These children we were just in love with all of the children and the teachers. Honestly, and the reason we do it in underprivileged parts of the world is because for two really. One is because it's really needed, and they don't have access to education, and it's really important. And the other is that the pound goes a long way. Even now, when we're smashed against the dollar, in parts of India and other parts of the world, it still goes a long way. So 150,000 builds a school, for 1,800 children. We've got a second project we're supporting in Cambodia, which we'll be going over in January of next year. So to do exactly the same thing. So really believe it's very important, to give back, and that goes back to my roots, my origin really. So I'm Sikh by upbringing, and as Sikhs, we're taught seva, and seva is the act of giving, without any consequence to yourself, right? So you give, you help and you give unconditionally, and you don't take anything back for it. So I've always been brought up like that, and I think if you're in a position of, strength, you should help those that are less so. I've always thought like that. So it's something we foster here at Bulletproof, and out of the pitch fees that we donate to charity, anyone at Bulletproof can nominate a charity that's close to their hearts, for personal reasons, and we'll support it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Gush. I'm just in awe, and I'm sure our listeners are as well.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed hearing Gush's story, please share this episode with your friends, and don't forget to leave a review. It really does make a difference. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next week for more sound advice, Entrepreneurs Unfiltered.